In the summer of 2003, a man knelt beside a dead river. The water below him crawled along, warm and slow and shallow. He pressed one hand flat against the surface and felt nothing at all. No cold rose off it, and no current pulled at his fingers. The bed beneath the murk was packed hard with gray, airless silt. A sour smell came up where the mud met the warm air. Green algae hung in the slack water like wet hair on a comb. Nothing moved down there, no fish, no shadow, no small darting thing. He had grown up in a cottage 2 fields from this water. As a boy, he had watched it run clear and quick over gravel. He remembered brown trout holding steady in the current below the bank. He remembered eels as thick as his wrist moving upstream after dark. On June evenings back then, mayflies had lifted off the water in clouds. His grandfather had walked this bank with him and named every bird. Kingfishers had nested in the sandy cut where the old river turned. He remembered the machines that came the summer he turned 6. Men from the drainage board dug the bends clean out of the river. They straightened it to carry water off the fields and away fast. They said a straight channel would stop the winter floods for good. His father had stood at the gate and called it real progress. The river lost its bends, and then, over the years, it lost everything. The willows were felled so the big machines could reach the banks. Without willows there was no shade, and the water began to warm. Warm water holds less oxygen, and oxygen is what a river runs on. The straight channel moved too fast to drop its silt anywhere useful, so the silt smothered the gravel where the trout had always spawned. The mayflies went, and then the fish, and then the birds after them. By the time he was a grown man, the river was a ditch. It carried water off the land, and it carried nothing else alive. He stood up that summer day, wiped his hand, and looked downstream. The channel ran dead straight to the horizon, flat and bright and bare. He was 41 years old, and he made his decision on that bank. He would give whatever years he had left to bringing the river back. He owned the 2 fields that ran along one side of the water. The rest belonged to farmers who thought the ditch worked well enough. He did not tell many people because the few he told just laughed. A farmer 3 fields over called it a rich man's foolish hobby. The drainage board reminded him the channel was theirs to manage, not his. His own father asked why he wanted to wreck good, honest work. He had no clean answer to give them, so he simply began alone. He started with the one part of the river that was fully his. The first thing he did looked to his neighbors like plain neglect. He stopped mowing the banks and let the grass grow tall and rough. Within a single season, the bare mud vanished under nettle and sedge. Roots reached down and began to bind the crumbling soil back together. That first wet winter, he planted willow along the water's edge. He cut the whips from an old tree and pushed them into the mud. Most of them took, because willow wants to live more than anything does. He planted alder for the banks and hawthorn for the birds to nest. He set a few young oaks well back to grow huge in time. The willows grew fast and threw the first real shade onto the water. Shade was the one thing the river had been starving for all along. That first summer of shade, the water cooled by 2 whole degrees. He could not see the change, but he felt it with his hand. It was small, and it was the first thing that had gone right. He kept a notebook and wrote the water temperature down each morning. The numbers were dull for years, and then, slowly, they were not. Cattle from the next farm had trampled the banks to bare mud for years. Their hooves broke the edges down and their weight fouled the water. He fenced them off from his stretch with posts and a single wire. He left one gentle place where they could drink without wrecking the bank. Within 2 summers, the fenced banks grew steep and green and firm. Reeds and flag iris rose where the mud had been churned and bare. Marsh marigold opened yellow in the wet ground each early spring. Watercress spread in the clean margins where the cold water seeped through. The fence cost him little and gave the river back its edges. He had learned that keeping heavy animals off the bank was half the work. The straight channel was still the deep problem, and he knew it well. Water raced through it too fast to build a single decent pool. A living river needs quick runs and slow pools set side by side. His had neither, just one flat hurrying sheet from end to end. so he began to put fallen wood back into the water on purpose. He dragged whole branches in and pinned them to the bed with stakes. The current piled against the wood and was forced to swirl and slow. Behind each jam, the water dug itself a deeper, cooler, calmer pool. In front of each jam, the flow scoured the silt off the gravel. Gravel was where the trout would spawn, if they ever came back. He was giving the river back its own tools to use. He worked most evenings after his day job, until the light failed. His hands cracked and bled in the cold water through that first winter. He learned to read the river by the sound it made at each bend. He worked with a spade, a bow saw, a maul, and his hands. He kept a pair of waders by the door and wore them thin. Every spare hour for years went down to that one stretch of water. Friends stopped asking him along, because they knew where he would be. He did not mind the loss, because the river had become the company. He came to know the water at every hour and in each season. He knew where the first light struck the surface in high summer. He knew which pool the heron chose and which branch the wagtail liked. The river gave him a reason to rise before dawn for 20 years. Then the first big winter flood came and tore his work apart. The river rose brown and furious and ripped 3 jams clean out. He stood in the rain and watched a season of labor float off. For a week he did not go back down to look at it. When he did, he saw the flood had cut a fresh bend itself. The water had done in one night what he had attempted for months. He stopped fighting the river's power and started working with it instead. He rebuilt the jams lower and looser so the floods would shape them. After that, each winter flood left the river a little more alive. The channel began to wander again, the way it had before his birth. He began to narrow the over-wide bed with bundles of cut brushwood. Pinned along the edges, the bundles trapped silt and became living banks. Squeezed narrower, the river ran deeper and faster and scoured itself clean. Fresh gravel appeared where there had been nothing but gray mud for years. The sour smell faded from the water over 3 or 4 seasons. The green algae thinned as the shade grew and the flow ran cool. He could see the bed again through water that had gone clear. On a bright day, the gravel shone gold and gray below the surface. Then came a summer so dry the river shrank to a thin trickle. The young willows drooped, and some of them browned and died right back. He carried water to the youngest trees in buckets, evening after evening. His back gave out that August, and still he carried the buckets. Most of the willows lived, and the dead ones he simply replaced. That autumn a neighbor reported him to the drainage board in anger. The board sent a man to inspect the wood he had placed. The inspector expected a blocked ditch and a flooding risk to the fields. Instead, he found cool pools, clean gravel, and clear water running through. He wrote in his report that the channel was in better health. The board let the work stand, though the neighbor never quite forgave him. The money came out of his own pocket, year after patient year. He sold a strip of land he owned to pay for more trees. Some nights he sat alone and wondered if he had wasted his life. Then morning came, and he went back down to the bank again. In the 8th year, the beavers arrived on the river by themselves. He never released them, and for a long while he did not know. He found a planted willow chewed clean through at its base. His first thought was thieves with a saw, and he grew angry. Then he saw the tooth marks, wide and paired, cut at an angle. A wild beaver had come up his river in the night to work. Beavers had been gone from that whole country for 400 years. Now one had found the willows he planted and moved straight in. He should have worried, and instead he sat down and laughed aloud. The beaver did in one season what had cost him nearly 8 years. It felled willows, dammed a side channel, and dug canals through the mud. Behind the dam a pond spread wide and slow across the low ground. The pond soaked into the earth and lifted the water table around it. In the dry weeks of late summer, that stored water fed the river. Where the man built with stakes and sweat, the beaver built by instinct. The two of them, never once meeting, worked the same river together. He learned the beaver's habits and left the best willows standing for it. Come spring, the beaver had kits, and the pond grew larger still. The dam once flooded a corner of the angry neighbor's lowest field. He paid the man for the lost grass rather than tear the dam out. It was cheaper than any pump, and it held the drought at bay. A beaver cannot hear running water without needing to stop the sound. That one stubborn instinct had built wetlands across the land for ages. Now it was building one again, one wet night at a time, for free. The pond became a world of its own within a couple of years. Frogs and toads laid their spawn in the warm shallows each spring. Dragonflies hunted low over the water on the hot, still afternoons. A moorhen picked her way across the lily pads with careful steps. A grass snake swam the pond with its head held above the surface. Herons stood in the margins at dawn, waiting on the frogs below. The dead straight ditch had grown a beating heart off to one side. Teal and mallard dropped onto the pond through the autumn and winter. Snipe probed the soft margins at dusk with their long, straight bills. Newts hung in the warm shallows in spring, waiting their turn to breed. A barn owl began to quarter the wet meadow for voles at dusk. That winter, the village downstream flooded less than it had for years. The beaver ponds and wet meadows held the rain and let it go slowly. The water that once raced off the fields now lingered on the land. What the drainage board had rushed away, the river now kept in store. 10 years in, the river looked alive, though he knew it was not. It bent now, and it pooled, and it ran cold under green shade. The banks were thick with sedge and loosestrife and the hum of bees. White flowers of water crowfoot trailed in the faster, cleaner runs. A stranger would have called the work finished and the river fully healed. He knew better, because he knew what a living river should hold. He would kneel and turn the stones on the gravel and find them bare. No small cased grubs clung beneath them, no crawling nymphs, nothing. The river had a body now, and a shape, but it had no engine. The engine of a river is the tiny life between its stones. Mayflies, caddisflies, and stoneflies are the base that feeds all the rest. The caddis grub builds a case of sand and stick around itself. The stonefly nymph will only live in water that is cold and clean. They are fragile, and they refuse to live in water that is fouled. Their absence told him the water still carried something he could not see. One spring he turned a stone and found freshwater shrimp beneath it. They flicked sideways across his palm, the first small life in years. He let himself hope, and then he made himself hold that hope back. Shrimp can bear water that a mayfly grub would never survive in. Their return was a start, and only a start, and he knew it. He suspected the farms upstream and the fertilizer washing off their fields. So he gave more land to the river and let it clean itself. He fenced a wide strip and let it flood and grow rough and wet. The floods spread thin across that ground and dropped their silt and poison. What reached the river below was cleaner than it had been in decades. The buffer was tested the year a slurry tank burst on a farm upstream. Downstream of the town, the spill killed fish for 2 whole miles. On his stretch, the wide, wet meadow caught the worst of it first. His pools clouded for a week and then slowly ran clear again. Not one of his fish died, and the gravel stayed clean beneath them. The strip of land he had given away had paid him back in full. Then he did the hardest thing of all, which was to wait once more. He turned the stones each spring and found them bare, year after year. In winter the river ran clear and cold and steamed at first light. He would stand in the frost and see his own work holding firm. The shape was right, the shade was right, the water clean and cool. Still the stones stayed bare, and still the mayflies did not come. He began to fear he had missed one thing he could not name. He read old books on rivers by lamplight through the long winters. He checked the water for poison and found it clean every time. The water was clean, so the one thing missing was time. He was past 60 now, and he wondered if he would ever see it. His father died that winter, still calling the whole thing a waste. He buried him, and in the spring he went back to the river. The thing that came back first was not the thing he had watched for. He had spent 20 years waiting for the return of the trout. He had pictured the day a fish would rise in a pool he made. That was the single moment the whole long project had been built around. It did not arrive that way, and what arrived instead undid him. It was a still evening in the 20th June, gold on the water. He was walking the bank home, tired, not really looking at anything. Something brushed his face, and he swatted at it, thinking of a midge. Then he stopped. because the air above the river was full of them. Thousands of pale insects were lifting straight off the water at once. They rose in a slow, shimmering column that caught the last low sun. They were mayflies, hatching together, the way they had when he was small. He knelt down on the wet grass just to be certain of it. He caught one gently on a finger and held it to the light. 3 long tails, 2 upright wings like stained glass, 1 soft body. This was the animal that would not live in bad water at any price. Its grubs had been down in his gravel for a year, growing, hidden. He had turned those same stones a season back and somehow missed them. The engine had been running under his feet and he had not heard. He stayed by the river until the light failed and the hatch fell quiet. He was weeping and he was not quite sure when it had begun. 20 years of stakes and willows and dull numbers had led to this. He had wanted a fish or a bird and got flies instead. The smallest thing in the whole river was the one that mattered most, because if the mayflies could live here, everything above them could follow. Bats came out at dusk to hunt the hatch over the water. Swallows had worked the same hatch low across the pools all evening. The whole air along his river had become a place worth feeding in. Dragonfly nymphs crawled the stems, and caddis grubs paved the stones. The dead water of his boyhood had grown a full food web. Every layer now fed the one above, grubs below and otters over. He walked home in the dark that night, lighter than he had in years. He wrote 3 words in the notebook and nothing more that day. The words were mayfly hatch, at last, and then he closed the book. He slept badly that night, too full of what he had seen. In the morning he went straight back to be sure it was real. The mayflies had gone, but their spent wings lay on the water. Small trout were rising to them in rings across the calm pool. The first fish had risen, at last, right where he had dreamed. And follow they did, faster than he had let himself dare to hope. The hatch was a table set, and the guests came within a few weeks. First the small fish appeared, the minnows and bullheads and stone loach. They had survived downstream and now pushed up into the cleaner water. They came for the drifting nymphs and the fallen flies on the surface. Where the gravel had been empty, there were now dark flicking shapes. He would stand on the little bridge and watch them shoal in the shallows. Then, in the second autumn after the hatch, the trout came to spawn. He found the first red cut into clean gravel below a log jam. A female had turned on her side and dug a nest with her tail. In it she had left the eggs he had waited 2 decades to see. He did not touch it, and he told no one for a whole week. He visited it each dawn like a man visiting something close to holy. The eggs hatched in spring, and tiny trout hid among the cold stones. That same year the eels came back, sliding up from the distant sea. He saw one at dusk pour itself over a wet stone like oil. Brook lamprey spawned in the shallows, pale and twisting on the gravel. The trout that stayed grew heavy and dark in the deeper pools below. An angler asked one day if he might fish the private stretch. He said no, and he has said no to every angler since. The fish were proof of a living river, and he guarded them. The river he had knelt beside as a dead thing was breeding again. With the fish came the birds, because the birds go where fish are. A gray wagtail arrived first, bobbing on a midstream stone, catching flies. Then one bright morning, a kingfisher shot upstream like a thrown blue spark. It had come because there were now small fish worth diving for. It perched on a willow branch he had pushed into the mud himself. That spring the kingfishers dug a nest in the soft new bank. By summer he watched the young birds line up along a low branch. A heron began to stalk the shallow pools in the gray first light. A dipper, a bird that walks underwater, worked the riffles for grubs. Each new arrival was a sign that the layer below it was full. Birds stay only where the food stays, and food stays where it breeds. His river was passing every test that no one had asked it to take. He added the new birds to the notebook beside the old dull numbers. The pages that once held nothing now filled up with living names. A hard winter froze the shallows, and he feared for the kingfishers. They moved to the fast runs that stayed open below the jams. When the thaw came, the pair were still there, hunting the edges. The river he built now carried its own life through the worst weeks. Along the soft banks the water voles came back to dig their burrows. He would hear the small plop as one slid into the water. Voles need soft earth and thick cover and slow, clean water to thrive. His banks now gave them all three, where the ditch had given none. His handwriting had begun to shake a little with his age by then. He wrote the kingfisher down twice, because once did not feel enough. The river trust heard of the place and sent a young woman to survey. She walked the bank slowly, writing down every living thing she saw. She asked him how many people and how much money it had taken. He told her 1 man, 20 years, and less than a good car. She counted more than 40 kinds of bird along a single mile. She found trout, eel, lamprey, bullhead, and the shrimp beneath the stones. The water now ran 7 degrees cooler in summer than the old ditch. She asked to bring her students out, and he agreed to that. His one condition was that his own name stay out of it entirely. Word spread anyway, the way water finds its way downhill in the end. 2 farms upstream fenced their banks and planted willow of their own. A stretch dead for 50 years slowly began to knit itself together. His river was becoming the top of a longer living thread of water. The last to return were the animals that need a whole river to live. One evening he found a neat pile of cracked mussel shells on a rock. Something had fed there, opening them with care and patience and time. A week later he saw it, low and dark, rippling along the far bank, an otter, the animal that only lives where a river is fully whole. An otter needs fish and clean water, and cover and calm together. It cannot fake its way into a place, and it cannot be fooled. Its arrival was the river's own verdict, given without a single word. The straight ditch of 2003 could not have fed a mouse. This river could feed an otter, and an otter is a hungry thing. He watched it fish the pool below the beaver dam and slip under. He did not move for a long time after it had gone. Everything he had done for 20 years stood in that dark, sliding shape. 2 winters on, the otter had cubs playing on the same far bank. He found their marks on the flat rocks, dark and musky and sweet. The cubs slid down the mud into the pool for the joy of it. He watched from the willows and never let them catch his scent. A whole family now lived on water that had once been dead. The mayfly had told him the base was sound and the water clean. The trout had told him the middle of the web was holding fast. The otter told him the whole thing, top to bottom, was alive. 3 animals, arriving in their proper order, had written the story for him. He is getting old now, and he still walks the bank most mornings. The river bends where he taught it to bend and pools where he asked. Willows he cut as bare sticks now stand 40 feet tall in summer. The water runs cold in August, when the old ditch ran warm and dead. Beavers he never invited keep building the ponds that hold back the droughts. The farmers who once mocked him now draw on that stored water in July. Orchids come up in the wet meadow that he leaves unmown each year. A pair of swans nested on the beaver pond one cold March morning. His knees ache on the walk he once ran down as a boy. He goes slower now, and the river does not mind the wait. Children from the village catch mayflies in jars and let them go again. He brings his grandson to the bank on warm evenings in June. He names the birds for the boy the way his grandfather once did. The boy holds a mayfly on one finger and asks what it means. He tells him it means the water is clean and the river alive. The boy will not remember the ditch, and that is the whole point. None of them know the man on the bank made all of this happen. He likes it that way, for the river needs no name of his. He was never truly the one who brought the life back here. He only cleared the path, then stepped aside and let it come. The willows brought the shade, and the shade brought the cold, clean flow. The wood brought the pools, and the beaver brought the ponds and the water. The clean water brought the mayflies, and the mayflies brought back the rest. He learned the deepest lesson slowly, across 20 stubborn and patient years. You cannot force a river to live, and you cannot rush its parts. You can only give it back its shade and its bends and its time. When he first knelt at that dead water, he meant to rebuild it himself. In the end, the river rebuilt itself and let him stand and watch. The smallest creature came back first and carried the largest promise of all. On still June evenings, the mayflies still rise, and he still stops to watch.